The sandstorm had swallowed the convoy whole, turning midday into twilight across the Afghan valley. Staff Sergeant Marcus Veneman lay pressed against the scorched undercarriage of the overturned MRAP, his left leg twisted at an angle that made breathing difficult. Blood seeped through his tourniquet into the dust. Above him, the sky flickered with tracer fire, a symphony of death conducted by an enemy he couldn't see. His radio crackled with the voices of men dying in vehicles he'd shared coffee with that morning. The QRF was 40 minutes out. He had maybe 10. The Taliban fighters were closing the perimeter, their shadows moving through the dust like sharks through murky water. Veneman's rifle clicked empty. He reached for his sidearm and found his hand shaking not from fear but from blood loss. This was how it ended then. 23 years old farm kid from Nebraska dying in a country whose mountains looked nothing like home. He keyed his radio one last time. Any station, this is Chaos 26. Grid November Tango 4728, we are combat ineffective. Multiple urgent surgical, request immediate CAS over. Static answered him. Then a voice calm as Sunday morning broke through. Chaos 26, Hog 11, copy your traffic. Type 3 CAS 30 seconds. Veneman's vision blurred. 30 seconds. The universe had shrunk to the sound of his own heartbeat and the shuffle of boots in sand growing closer. He'd never seen an A-10 Thunderbolt arrive on station. Not really, not from the ground. But he heard it. The sound started as a distant industrial roar, building into something that felt like the Earth's crust tearing open. Then the GAU-8 Avenger cannon opened up, and the world became a sustained mechanical screamer sound not made for human ears. 65 rounds per second of 30 hate turned the hillside into an eruption of dust and flame. The incoming fire ceased instantly. The shadows retreated. When the dust settled enough for Veneman to see, he caught a glimpse of the aircraft banking hard overhead squat, ugly, built like something designed by people who'd forgotten aerodynamics and remembered only violence. But there was something wrong with it. Even through his fatting vision, he could see metal peeled back along the right engine nacre, hydraulic fluid misting in the slipstream, and what looked like an entire section of the vertical stabilizer simply gone. The jet was dying in the air, yet it had come back. Someone flying that broken machine had turned around and come back. The radio crackled again. Chaos 26, Hog 11, QRF has your position. Stay alive, Marine. That's an order. Veneman closed his eyes and breathed. Just breathed. The voice on the radio had been steady, almost gentle. He'd expected tactical brevity, the clipped efficiency of someone executing a mission. Instead, he'd heard something else, something that sounded like a promise made by someone who intended to keep it. The A-10 made another pass, lower this time, its gun silent but its presence alone enough to scatter the remaining fighters. The aircraft carved through the dust like a prehistoric thing, all titanium bathtub cockpit and straight wings that seemed to mock the concept of grace. It was designed to be shot at and survive, to trade speed for armor, to absorb damage that would disintegrate any other airframe and keep flying. But this one had clearly absorbed more than its share. The right main landing gear door hung loose, flapping in the slipstream. Panels were missing from the fuselage, revealing hydraulic lines and cable bundles that looked like exposed nerves. Veneman counted at least a dozen impact sites along the wing, ragged holes that told stories of 23 anti-aircraft fire. The jet should have RTB'd returned to base, the moment it took that damage. Instead it had pressed, turned back, engaged. The other Marines from the convoy were crawling toward him now, dragging wounded, returning fire toward threats that no longer materialized. Corporal Davies reached him first, his face blackened with soot and blood that wasn't his own. "Jesus, Sarge, that pilot just saved our asses." Veneman nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Above them, the wounded A-10 circled once more, then banked west toward Bagram. It flew with a visible list to the right, compensating for asymmetric damage, trailing vapor. He watched until it disappeared into the haze, wondering who was flying it. What kind of person turned a crippled jet around to help strangers? The QRF arrived in a thunderstorm of rotor wash and diesel exhaust, Black Hawks settling into defensive positions while the ground convoy rolled in. Medics swarmed Veneman, starting lines, calling out vitals, prepping him for flight. As they loaded him onto the litter, he kept his eyes on the sky, on the direction the A-10 had taken. "That pilot," he mumbled to the flight medic. "Find out who that was." The medic, focused on his IV placement, didn't respond, but Davies, climbing into the bird alongside him, pulled out his notepad. "Hog 1-1, I got the call sign. We'll find out." At Bagram Airfield, the maintenance crews were already swarming the aircraft when Captain Lena, Revenant, Kovic shut down the engines. The Wright GETF-34 turbofan had been howling like a wounded animal for the last 60 miles, the damaged Naker creating vibrations she'd felt through the control column like a second heartbeat. She'd nursed the jet home on 1.5 engines, degraded hydraulics, and the kind of luck that doesn't last. The crew chief appeared at her ladder, face tight with professional anger that wasn't directed at her, but at whatever had done this to his aircraft. "Ma'am, permission to speak freely." Kovic pulled off her helmet, her dark hair plastered to her skull with sweat. "Granted. You flew this back." He gestured at the fuselage like a man indicating a crime scene. "This should have been a bailout. You should have punched out and let the insurance handle it." She climbed down slowly, her legs cramped from holding rudder pressure for the entire flight back. Had troops in contact. They needed eyes on. The crew chief, Senior Master Sergeant Chen, according to his name, tape-walked her around the aircraft, showing her what she'd felt but couldn't see from the cockpit. 23 confirmed hits. The right stabilizer was held on by what looked like structural hope. Hydraulic systems A and B were compromised, which meant she'd flown home on the emergency backup. 3 hydraulic reservoirs were empty. The right main gear had deployed only because of gravity, not hydraulics, and there was a hole through the right horizontal stabilizer you could throw a basketball through. "Ma'am," Chen said quietly, "I've been turning wrenches on hogs for 22 years. I've never seen one this torn up make it home." Kovic touched the fuselage gently, almost reverently. "She's a tough bird." "Nah," Chen shook his head. "Birds don't make decisions. You did. You kept her flying." Other maintainers were gathering now, drawn by the spectacle of the damage. Kovic could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, the physics that said this aircraft shouldn't have remained controllable, the aerodynamics that said she should have lost it in the turn back toward the convoy. One of the younger airmen, barely old enough to shave, spoke up. "Is it true you went back after taking these hits?" Kovic met his eyes. "Marines were dying. That's the job." She walked toward the debriefing room before anyone could ask more questions. The ops center was organized chaos when Kovic entered, radios crackling with traffic from aircraft still airborne, intelligence officers updating threat maps, the squadron commander standing by the coffee maker with an expression that fell somewhere between relief and fury. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes was a former Warthog driver himself, 25 years in cockpits, and he knew exactly what he was looking at when he examined the gun camera footage Kovic had uploaded. "Lena," he said, which meant this conversation would be somewhere between official and personal. "Walk me through it." She did, keeping her voice steady, using the tactical language that kept emotion at a distance. She'd been number 2 in a flight of 2, flying CAP combat air patrol over Helmand Province when the call came in. Type 3 CAS, troops in heavy contact, 9-line incomplete because the JTAC was too busy bleeding to finish the brief. Her flight lead, Major Simmons, had been Winchester out of ammunition from an earlier engagement. That left Kovic as the only gun available within 15 minutes of the grid. She'd rolled in, acquired targets, engaged with the GAU-8. That's when the sky had lit up with AAA anti-aircraft artillery, 23 tracers rising toward her like angry fireflies. She'd taken hits on the first pass, felt the jet shudder, seen the master caution lights illuminate like a Christmas tree. Book said RTB. Every instinct said get this bird home before something catastrophic failed. But the radio had been full of voices of men dying, of the desperation that sounds the same in every language. "So I made another pass," she said simply. Barnes set down his coffee. "With how many systems compromised?" "Most of them, sir." "And you didn't punch out because?" "Because the Marines needed eyes on for the QRF. Someone had to keep the Taliban suppressed until the cavalry arrived." Barnes studied her for a long moment. Outside the window, the damaged A-10 sat on the ramp surrounded by maintainers and officers conducting their own examinations. "You know what they're going to say," he said finally. "That you took an unnecessary risk, that you endangered a $20 million aircraft for a handful of grunts. That good CAS means staying alive to fight tomorrow, not committing suicide today." Kavik had heard these arguments before, not about this mission but about others, about the philosophy that separated those who flew CAS from those who simply flew. "Sir, with respect, those Marines didn't have a tomorrow without someone overhead. That was the mission." Barnes nodded slowly. "You're not wrong, but you're also not going to make it easy for me to defend you when Wing gets wind of this." He pulled up the maintenance assessment on his computer. "Chen is saying this bird won't fly again for 8 weeks minimum, maybe longer. That's one hog out of an already undermanned squadron in the middle of a combat deployment." "Understood, sir." "You don't sound sorry." "I'm not, sir. I'd make the same call again." Barnes allowed himself a small smile. "Yeah, I know you would. That's what worries me." Dismissed. Kavik left the ops center and walked across the ramp toward her quarters. The sun was setting over the Hindu Kush, turning the mountains into layers of purple and gold that would have been beautiful if she'd had the energy to appreciate them. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally draining away, replaced by the crash that always came after. She thought about the voice on the radio, the Marine who'd sounded so young and so tired. She wondered if he'd made it, if the medevac had reached him in time, if the wounds were survivable. She'd never know, probably. That wasn't how it worked. You dropped ordnance, you suppressed threats, you cleared the QRF in, and then you went home. The outcomes weren't yours to measure, but she'd heard something in that Marine's voice that had made the decision for her, that had made turning around in a crippled aircraft feel not like heroism, but like simple mathematics: one dying jet versus a dozen dying men. The equation had been easy. In her room, she sat on the edge of her bunk and unlaced her boots with fingers that still trembled slightly. The adrenaline crash was hitting harder than usual, bringing with it the inevitable replay of the mission, the what-ifs and could-have-beens that every pilot dealt with after they'd pushed the envelope and survived. Her roommate, Captain Jordan "Hex" Williams, was already asleep on the opposite bunk, exhausted from her own missions. Kavik tried to be quiet, but Hex woke anyway, the way combat pilots always did, attuned to any sound that wasn't normal. "You good?" Hex asked, voice blurred with sleep. "Yeah, just a long day." Hex sat up, suddenly more alert. "I heard. Maintenance is losing their minds over your jet. Chen texted me pictures, said it looks like you flew through a blender." Kavik pulled off her flight suit, wincing at muscles that had been tensed for hours. "Chen's dramatic. Chen's a master sergeant with 22 years of experience who said you shouldn't be alive." That stopped Kavik mid-motion. She looked at her roommate, at the genuine concern visible even in the dim light. "But I am. And so are the Marines I covered." Hex swung her legs out of bed, suddenly serious. "Lena, I'm not saying you made the wrong call. I'm saying you made a call that's going to have people talking, and not all of that talk is going to be supportive. Let them talk. I'm not worried about your ego. I'm worried about your career. There's a difference between being brave and being reckless, and sometimes that difference is just perspective. The brass might see this as the latter." Kavik sat down heavily on her own bunk. "The Marines see it as the former. That's what matters." Hex was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "You're probably right. Doesn't mean the next few weeks won't be interesting." She was more right than she knew. By the next morning, the story had spread through Bagram with the velocity that only military gossip achieves. Kavik arrived at the squadron ready room to find a dozen pilots already there, ostensibly for the morning briefing but clearly waiting to see her. Major Simmons, her flight lead from yesterday, stood as she entered. "Revenant, hell of a day you had." The use of her call sign, not her rank, told her this was pilot to pilot, not military formality. "Just another day at the office, Blade," Simmons snorted. "If your office is usually on fire and missing pieces." The briefing covered routine items, weather, threat assessments, scheduled CAS missions, but Kavik could feel the attention on her, the questions that weren't being asked aloud. When Barnes dismissed them, several pilots hung back and she knew what was coming. "So is it true?" This from Captain Rodriguez, Coulson Smoke, a younger pilot who transferred in from F-16s and still flew like he thought speed solved everything. "Is what true? That you made 2 passes in a crippled jet?" Kavik grabbed coffee from the pot that was always lukewarm and always too strong. "I made the passes that were necessary to complete the mission." Rodriguez whistled low. "That's not an answer. That's a Medal of Honor citation." "It's a tactical decision," Kavik corrected. "Nothing more." But she could see the way they were looking at her, and she recognized it. The mixture of admiration and judgment that female pilots in combat roles learn to navigate from day one. She'd proven herself a dozen times over in 3 deployments, had more combat hours than most of the squadron combined, and still there were those who saw her decisions through a lens shaped by gender, who wondered if she was compensating for something, proving something, taking risks a male pilot wouldn't take. Major Simmons seemed to read her thoughts. "Revenant flew it exactly right," he said, his voice carrying the authority of flight lead and senior officer. "I was Winchester, the tick was hot, and she was the only gun available. She engaged, took damage, and made the correct assessment that the mission required continued presence. By the book." It wasn't quite by the book, and everyone there knew it, but Simmons's support mattered. He'd been flying A-10 since before Kavik had graduated from college, and his opinion carried weight. The group dispersed slowly, heading to their own missions, their own briefings. Kavik felt Hex appear at her shoulder. "That could have gone worse. Could have gone better. Nah, Blade vouching for you in front of the youngsters, that's pure gold. That's the story that spreads, not the worried maintenance reports." Kavik hoped she was right. But as the day progressed, as she sat through the formal debriefing with intelligence officers who wanted every detail of the engagement, as she filled out the mountain of paperwork that accompanied any aircraft damage, she felt the weight of scrutiny that came with having made a decision that existed in the gray area between heroism and recklessness. The formal investigation would take weeks. Until then, she was grounded standard procedure after significant aircraft damage where pilot decision-making might be questioned. Barnes had told her as much that afternoon, his tone apologetic but firm. "It's not punishment," he'd said. "It's process. Let the safety officers do their thing, let maintenance work their magic, and you'll be back in the air before you know it." Being grounded felt like amputation. Kavik spent her days in the squadron spaces, attending briefings for missions she wouldn't fly, updating targeting folders she wouldn't use, and watching the other pilots head to the flight line while she remained behind. The forced inactivity gave her too much time to think, to replay the mission, to question decisions that had felt clear in the moment but grew murky in retrospect. On the 3rd day, Hex dragged her to the gym. "You're going to drive yourself crazy sitting around." They ran on treadmills that faced a window overlooking the flight line, watching A-10's taxi and launch, their ungainly profiles transforming into lethal grace once airborne. Kavik's replacement aircraft, not hers, would never be hers in the way that first one had been, was still being prepared, cycling through maintenance checks that would eventually clear it for combat. "Do you regret it?" Hex asked between breaths, her pace steady and punishing. "Which part?" Turning around, going back. Kavik thought about the question, about the Marine's voice on the radio, about the weight of the jet beneath her hands as it had fought to stay airborne. "No, I'd do it again exactly the same, even knowing what it would cost. A jet can be repaired, those Marines couldn't be." Hex was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "That's the right answer, but you need to understand that not everyone sees it that way. To some people, especially people who don't fly, who don't understand what it means to be overhead when people are dying, your decision looks like cowboy shit, like you prioritized glory over good judgment." The words stung because they were true, because Kavik had heard the whispers in the chow hall, the carefully neutral tones when certain officers discussed the incident. "I didn't do it for glory. I know that. Everyone who matters knows that. But perception is reality in the military, and you need to be ready for the possibility that the investigation doesn't go your way." Kavik increased her pace, pushing her body harder, using physical pain to drown out the uncertainty. "Then I'll deal with it." But that night, Alone in her room while Hex was flying a midnight CAS orbit, Kavik pulled out her phone and did something she rarely allowed herself to do. She looked up the news coverage of the incident. The story had leaked, as stories always did. A-10 pilot saves convoy in daring rescue, read one headline. Another, from a military blog she didn't recognize, was less flattering. Pilot's risky decision raises questions about CAS protocol. The comments sections were predictable warfare veterans praising her, civilians debating military ethics, and a disturbing number of people focusing not on the tactical situation but on her gender. Female pilot takes unnecessary risk to prove herself, one comment read, and Kavik closed the browser before she could read further. She knew that path led nowhere good, that engaging with internet discourse was like wrestling with ghosts. But the damage was done. The doubt that she'd successfully compartmentalized during the mission itself was now loose in her mind, asking questions she didn't want to answer. Had she taken the risk because it was tactically sound, or because some part of her, some deeply buried insecurity, needed to prove that she belonged in the cockpit of a close air support platform? Would a male pilot with her experience have made the same call, or would he have recognized the line between bravery and stupidity and stayed on the right side of it? She lay back on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, and forced herself to think through the mission again with cold, tactical precision. The variables, troops in contact, no other air assets available, degraded but flyable aircraft, enemy threat suppressed but not eliminated, QRF 20 minutes out. The requirements: maintain presence over the target area, prevent enemy reinforcement, provide reconnaissance for approaching ground forces. The decision: continue the mission despite aircraft damage. When she examined it that way, stripped of emotion and second-guessing, the logic remained sound. The risk to the aircraft had been acceptable given the certainty of casualties if she'd abandoned station. The damage, while significant, hadn't compromised flight safety to the point where continued operation was suicidal. She'd made the right call. She had to believe that, because if she started doubting her judgment in combat, she had no business being in a cockpit. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number forwarded through the squadron. Captain Kavik, this is SSGT Venom Chaos 26. I'm the Marine you pulled out. They told me you got your bird shot to hell keeping us alive. I don't have fancy words, but thank you. You saved 12 lives that day. We won't forget. Kavik read the message 3 times, then saved it. That night she slept without nightmares. The investigation took 11 days. 11 days of statement reviews, of flight data analysis, of maintenance reports and safety officer interviews. Kavik answered every question with the same measured precision she'd use in a weapons employment brief: facts, timelines, tactical rationale. On the 12th day, Lieutenant Colonel Barnes called her into his office. "Sit down, Captain." His tone was unreadable, which meant either very good news or very bad news. There was no middle ground with Barnes. Kavik sat, her spine straight, hands folded in her lap. Whatever was coming, she'd face it head-on. Barnes pulled up a document on his computer, then turned the screen so she could read it. Findings of the safety investigation. No pilot error. No violation of flight regulations. Tactical decision-making within acceptable parameters given the exigent circumstances. Aircraft loss avoided through superior airmanship. Commander's recommendation: return to flight status immediately. Kavik felt something in her chest unclench, a tension she hadn't fully acknowledged she'd been carrying. "Sir." Furthermore, Barnes continued, the ground unit you supported has submitted a joint commendation through their chain of command. The Air Force is considering a Distinguished Flying Cross. The Marines want to give you a Navy Cross, which they technically can't do because you're Air Force, but they're trying anyway. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "How do you feel?" It was an unexpectedly personal question from a commander who typically trafficked in tactical efficiency rather than emotional intelligence. "Relieved, sir. You should feel proud. You flew an incredibly damaged aircraft home against all odds and saved lives doing it. That's what we do. That's the entire point of the hog." Kavik nodded, not trusting herself to speak. But Barnes added, and there it was, "I need you to understand something. You got lucky." The variables lined up in your favor: the damage distribution, the weather, the fact that you're a better pilot than you have any right to be at your age. Next time, the variables might not line up, and I need you to promise me that you'll recognize when the line between heroism and suicide shifts. I will, sir. I'm not convinced you will, Barnes said, but his tone was gentle. Because I was a 30-year-old hog driver once, and I remember what it felt like to believe I was invincible. But you're not, none of us are, so promise me you'll be smart. Kavik met his eyes. I promise, sir. The return to flight status came with an unexpected complication. Kavik had become famous, at least within the small, insular world of close air support aviation. Pilots from other squadrons, other bases, other services, reached out through official and unofficial channels. Her inbox filled with messages ranging from sincere congratulations to requests for interviews to thinly veiled challenges from fighter pilots who thought CAS was beneath them and wanted to debate tactics. She ignored most of it, but there was one message she couldn't ignore from the sergeant major of the Marine unit she'd supported. Captain Kavik, the Marines of Chaos Company request the honor of your presence at our unit ceremony next month. We'd like to thank you properly. Also, Veneman wants to meet the voice from the radio. She forwarded the invitation to Barnes. Sir, permission to attend. He approved it immediately, and 3 weeks later, Kavik found herself on a C-130 heading to Camp Leatherneck, wearing her dress blues and feeling entirely out of place. Marines, she'd learned over multiple deployments, were a different breed, louder, rougher around the edges, with a kind of esprit de corps that bordered on religious fervor. She'd supported them from the air dozens of times, but she'd rarely interacted with them on the ground, where the abstractions of grid coordinates and radio calls became flesh and blood and consequence. The ceremony was held outdoors. The entire company formed up in desert camouflage, their faces showing the wear of a deployment that hadn't been easy. Kavik stood off to the side with the company commander, a captain whose age matched hers but whose eyes looked decades older. They're excited to meet you, he said. Veneman especially. Kid's been talking about it nonstop since he got out of the hospital. How is he? -1 spleen and plus a lot of metal in his leg, but alive. He'll deploy again if the docs clear him. The ceremony itself was brief and intense in the way Marine ceremonies always were: colors presented, citations read, medals pinned. Kavik received a challenge coin from the battalion commander, a piece of metal stamped with the unit insignia that meant more than its material value suggested. Then the formation broke, and suddenly she was surrounded by Marines, young men who wanted to shake her hand, to tell her where they'd been during the engagement, to make real the voice that had come through their radios. And then Veneman was there, limping slightly but standing straight, his utilities crisp and his bearing that of someone who decided being almost dead once wasn't going to define him. Captain Kavik, Staff Sergeant Marcus Veneman, Chaos 26. He extended his hand and she shook it, feeling the calluses of someone who worked with weapons and gear. Sergeant, good to see you on your feet. Good to be on them, ma'am. Wasn't sure I would be for a while there. Up close she could see he was younger than his voice had suggested, maybe 23, with the kind of corn-fed Nebraska look that belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting rather than a combat zone. But his eyes held the weight of having seen the elephant, of having looked at death close enough to smell it. I wanted to thank you, he said, and his voice was steady but his eyes were not. Not just for the CAS, for coming back. We heard the damage report eventually, what your bird looked like. You didn't have to turn around. Kavik chose her words carefully. Marines were in contact, that's the job. No ma'am, respectfully, the job is to provide close air support. The job isn't to commit suicide for grunts you've never met. You went beyond the job, that matters to us. Around them, the other Marines were listening, and Kavik realized this moment meant something to them beyond simple gratitude. They needed to believe that someone overhead gave a damn, that the voice on the radio wasn't just executing a tasking but actually cared whether they lived or died. You'd have done the same, she said finally. Veneman smiled, and it transformed his face from hardened warrior to farm kid. Maybe, but I can't fly, so I'm grateful someone who can feels the way you do. The company first sergeant appeared then, a grizzled master sergeant who looked like he'd been fighting wars since Vietnam. "Captain, we've got something for you, if you'll follow me." He led her to a corner of the compound where someone had spray-painted a crude but recognizable silhouette of an A-10 on a concrete T-wall barrier. Beneath it, in careful block letters, someone had written, HAWG-11, Chaos Company, never forgot. Kavik stared at it, at this permanent marker of a day that had lasted 20 minutes but would define careers and lives. "We wanted you to know," the first sergeant said, "that you're part of the family now. Marines don't forget." The flight back to Bagram felt different than the flight out. Kavik sat in the cargo webbing of the C-130, surrounded by pallets of equipment and a handful of other passengers, and tried to process what she'd experienced. She'd flown combat missions for 3 years, had put ordnance on target in a dozen different countries, had spent hundreds of hours overhead of troops in contact. But she'd never before confronted the physical reality of the people she was protecting, the weight of their gratitude, the burden of their survival. Hex was waiting when she landed, leaning against a truck with 2 cups of coffee and a knowing smile. "How was it?" "Intense. They make a big deal. They painted my call sign on a wall." Hex laughed. "That's Marine for 'We love you. Hope you're ready for the responsibility. You're going to be the benchmark now. Every CAS run, every troops in contact, they're going to remember the pilot who turned around in a dying jet." Kavik hadn't thought of it that way, but Hex was right. She'd set a standard, created an expectation that might be impossible for others to meet, that might get someone killed trying to replicate what had been equal parts skill and luck. "That's a hell of a weight," she said quietly. "It is, but you're strong enough to carry it." Back at the squadron, life settled into a rhythm that felt simultaneously normal and fundamentally altered. Kavik flew her scheduled missions, executed her CAS runs with the same precision she always had, but she was aware now of an additional layer of meaning to the work. Every grid coordinate was a venomant. Every troops in contact was 12 Marines who wanted to go home. The tactical had become personal in a way that was both motivating and dangerous. Barnes seemed to sense it. 2 weeks after her return, he pulled her aside after a mission brief. "How's your head, sir? Your judgment, your decision-making? Are you seeing the missions clearly, or are you seeing venom in every tick?" It was a question she'd been avoiding asking herself. "Both, maybe," Barnes nodded. "That's honest, and it's manageable as long as you stay aware of it. The day you start taking risks because you're trying to recreate that day, that's when I ground you permanently. Understood?" "Understood, sir." But she wondered if he was right, if that day was something that could be set aside rather than something that would color every decision from now, until she hung up her flight suit. The answer came 2 months later, on a mission that started as routine CAS for a small observation post near the Pakistani border. Kavik was flight lead this time, with Lieutenant Casey, Torch, manning as her wingman, a young pilot on his first deployment who flew with the cautious precision of someone still learning where the edges were. The op had taken sporadic fire throughout the day, nothing coordinated, just harassment from Taliban fighters who had nothing better to do than send occasional rounds toward the Americans on the hilltop. Kavik and Torch had been overhead for 40 minutes, boring holes in the sky, scanning for threats that weren't materializing. Then the radio exploded with traffic. "All stations, Eagle 37, troops in contact. Grid Papa Romeo 7942, requesting immediate CAS, multiple VicPid enemy fighters advancing on our position." The transmission cut off, replaced by the sound of sustained gunfire. Kavik rolled in without hesitation, acquiring the grid, her targeting pod scanning the terrain below. She could see the op, a small cluster of fortifications on a ridgeline, and she could see the advancing enemy fighters, maybe 30 of them, using a dried riverbed as an approach route. "Torch, Revenant, I'm in from the north. You hold high and keep SA on the surrounding area." "Copy, holding high." Kavik armed her GAU-8, ran through her engagement checklist with muscle memory that didn't require conscious thought, and rolled in. The gun run was textbook: proper dive angle, correct airspeed, target acquisition confirmed, squeeze the trigger and feel the jet shudder as 65 rounds per second left the gun. The riverbed erupted in dust and flame. Enemy fighters scattered. She pulled off target, climbing hard, checking her engine instruments out of habit learned from that previous mission. Everything green. No damage. She set up for another pass, and that's when her wingman's voice came over the radio, tight with adrenaline. Revenant Torch, I have SA on AAA approximately 2 clicks east of the op, tracking toward you. Kavak's blood went cold. Anti-aircraft artillery mobile hunting for her. Torch, can you engage? Negative, outside my gun range. The decision tree unfolded in her mind with crystalline clarity. She could break off, avoid the threat, leave the op to fend for itself until the AAA was suppressed. That was the safe choice, the by-the-book choice. Or she could press, make another run, suppress the ground fighters before they overran the op, and trust her aircraft and her skills to survive whatever the AAA threw at her. She thought about Barnes' warning, about the line between heroism and suicide, about the responsibility that came with survival, and she thought about Veneman, about the voice on the radio that had needed someone to come back. Torch, stand by for BDA. She rolled in again, this time with her eyes divided between the target area and the threat ring where the AAA was tracking. The calculation was simple. If she maintained her current dive angle, she'd be outside effective range for most of the pass. If she pulled out at the right moment, she'd minimize exposure. If she timed it perfectly, she'd suppress the ground fighters and escape before the AAA could lock her up. It was a thread to walk, thin and sharp, and one mistake would cut her. She pickled off her gun run, saw the rounds impact among the advancing fighters, watched them break and run. Then she pulled hard, feeling the G-forces press her into her seat, fighting the edge of GLOCG-induced loss of consciousness, as she turned perpendicular to the threat. The sky lit up with tracers, 23mm rounds, the same caliber that had nearly killed her last time, arcing through the space where she would have been if she'd held her dive angle 1 second longer. But she hadn't. She'd judged it right. Torch's voice came through, high and excited. Revenant, clean break, they never had firing solution. You're clear. Kavak leveled out at altitude, checking her systems again, confirming what her body already knew: she was undamaged, whole, alive. The ops radio traffic confirmed enemy fighters withdrawing, threat neutralized, no friendly casualties. Nice shooting, Revenant, the JTAC transmitted. Eagle 37 is secure. We appreciate the support. On the flight back to Bagram, Torch pulled alongside her, close enough that she could see him in his cockpit, giving her a thumbs-up that conveyed relief and admiration. She returned the gesture, but her mind was elsewhere, examining what had just happened. She'd pressed into a threat environment, had made tactical decisions that involved calculated risk, and had come out clean. And this was the critical part: she'd stayed within the bounds of acceptable risk. She hadn't pushed past the line where courage became stupidity. She'd walked up to that line, examined it, and stayed on the right side. That was the difference. That was what Barnes had been asking her to learn. In the debriefing, she walked the squadron intelligence officer through the mission with clinical precision, marking threat locations, enemy movements, engagement sequences. Barnes listened from the back of the room, saying nothing, but when the debrief ended and the intel officer left, he stayed. Good mission, he said. Yes, sir. You pressed, but you didn't overpress. You recognized the threat, calculated the risk, and executed within acceptable parameters. Kavak met his eyes. I remembered what you said, sir, about the line. And I found it. I know where it is now. Barnes nodded slowly. Good, that makes you not just a competent pilot but a mature one. The difference matters. He stood to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Lena, I'm proud of you. Not for the last mission, but for this one. The last one was instinct and skill. This one was wisdom. That's what makes a great CAS pilot. After he left, Kavak sat alone in the briefing room, staring at the mission map, thinking about wisdom and instinct and the evolution of judgment. She thought about the scared pilot she'd been on that first combat mission 3 years ago, about the confident pilot she'd been when she turned around in a damaged jet, and about the pilot she was becoming, someone who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear or the willingness to take any risk, but the ability to take the right risks for the right reasons. Her call sign, Revenant, had been given to her half-jokingly after her third deployment extension, the pilot who kept coming back, who refused to stay dead. But she understood now that it meant something deeper. A revenant was something that returned from death, but it also carried knowledge of death with it, an understanding of mortality that changed how it moved through the world. She died in that previous mission, at least metaphorically had pushed her aircraft and herself to the absolute edge of survival and somehow stepped back. That experience had killed the part of her that thought she was invincible. What had returned was someone better, someone who understood both the value of risk and the cost of recklessness. That night, she wrote an email to Veneman. It was brief, just a few lines checking on his recovery, letting him know she'd thought of him during her recent mission, thanking him for the reminder of why the job mattered. His response came the next day. "Ma'am, hearing from you made my week. I'm cleared for duty next month, heading back out. Maybe we'll work together again sometime. If so, I'll sleep a lot better knowing Hog 11 is overhead. Semper Fi." The deployment ended 6 weeks later with the usual mixture of relief and melancholy that came with leaving a combat zone. Kavik packed her gear, said her goodbyes to maintainers who'd kept her aircraft flying, and climbed aboard a C-17 for the long flight back to home station. But Afghanistan had one last surprise for her. During the stop at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, she was paged to the Air Operations Center. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes was there, along with a colonel she didn't recognize wearing Army tabs. "Captain Kavik," the colonel said, "I'm Colonel Matthews, Ground Component Commander for the unit you supported in November. I wanted to meet you before you headed home." They shook hands and Matthews gestured for her to sit. "I've read the reports, watched the gun camera footage, talked to my Marines. What you did that day turning around in a damaged aircraft, that's the kind of action that defines careers." Kavik felt her guard go up. Praise from senior officers often preceded complications. "I was doing my job, sir." "You were doing more than your job. You were embodying what CAS is supposed to be, the willingness to put yourself between threats and the people on the ground who need you." He pulled a folder from his briefcase. "The Distinguished Flying Cross has been approved. The ceremony will be at your home station next month. Additionally, Chaos Company has requested you as their primary CAS liaison for their next deployment. They want you specifically." Kavik looked at Barnes, who nodded. "It's a good opportunity. You'd be attached to their training cycle, help develop their CAS procedures, deploy with them as their primary air support. It's unusual, but given the relationship you've built, it makes sense." "Sir, I'm honored, but I'm Air Force. They're Marines. Isn't there some kind of service rivalry issue?" Matthews laughed. "Captain, when someone saves 12 Marines from certain death, service rivalry gets set aside. You're family to them now. That's worth more than any bureaucratic boundary." The assignment was unusual but not unprecedented. Kavik would remain Air Force, would fly from Air Force bases but would operate in direct support of a specific Marine unit, would brief their missions, study their tactics, become integrated into their operations in a way most CAS pilots never experienced. It was an opportunity to be more than a voice on the radio, to close the loop between air and ground in a way that could redefine how she understood the mission. "I accept, sir." Barnes smiled. "Good. Report to your new unit in 6 weeks. Enjoy your leave." Home station was Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona, where A-10s had been flying since the aircraft was new, and where the desert sky was almost always clear enough for training. Kavik arrived on a Tuesday morning, processed through the usual redeployment bureaucracy, and found herself standing in the parking lot of her apartment complex, wondering how to transition from combat to normal life. The disconnect was jarring as always, from a place where people shot at her daily to a place where the biggest concern was whether the grocery store had run out of her preferred coffee brand. Her phone buzzed with messages from family, from friends, from people who'd heard about the medal and wanted to congratulate her. She answered them mechanically, trying to match her tone to their enthusiasm, feeling like an actor reading lines in a language she no longer quite spoke. That night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion, she drove to the base and parked near the flight line. A-10 sat in neat rows under the sodium lights, waiting for tomorrow's sorties. She could see maintainers working late, pre-flighting aircraft for the next day's training missions. The scene was peaceful in a way that combat zones never were, and she found herself grateful for the boredom, for the routine, for the absence of life-and-death stakes in every decision. But she also felt restless, adrift, caught between the intensity of deployment and the mundanity of garrison life. Her phone buzzed again. Hex, who'd returned 2 weeks earlier. "You awake?" "Yeah, coffee, I'm at the Grind." The Grind was a 24-hour coffee shop near base that catered to the strange schedules of military life. Kavik found Hex at a corner table looking as tired as she felt. "Can't sleep either," Kavik asked. "Too quiet. I keep waiting for the mortars." It was said lightly, but they both knew it was true. Combat deployments rewired your nervous system in ways that took months to reset. "How long did it take you to adjust after your first deployment?" Kavik asked. Hex considered. 3 weeks to stop waking up at every noise. 3 months to stop planning escape routes everywhere I went. 6 months to stop feeling guilty about being safe while other people were still over there. And now? Now I'm on my 4th deployment cycle, and I've learned that you never fully adjust. You just get better at code switching between versions of yourself. They drank coffee and talked about nothing important, about movies they wanted to see, about the gossip from the squadron, about the mild scandal of a lieutenant who'd gotten caught dadding an airman in his flight. Normal conversation, the kind that felt like a foreign language after months of tactical brevity and mission-focused communication. "You nervous about the ceremony?" Hex asked eventually. The Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony was scheduled for the end of the month, would involve the wing commander, would be formal and official and impossible to hide from. "I don't like attention." "Too bad, you're getting it." Hex leaned forward. "But seriously, Lena, you should be proud. What you did was exceptional. Let people acknowledge that." "It feels weird, like I'm being celebrated for something that was just necessary." "That's exactly why it deserves recognition. You saw what needed to be done and you did it, even though it might have killed you. That's the definition of valor." Kavik turned her coffee cup in her hands, watching the liquid swirl. "I keep thinking about all the times I didn't make that choice. All the missions where I stayed within the comfortable margins, where I could have pressed harder, done more. That's survivor guilt talking. You can't judge past decisions against a standard you didn't have yet. Maybe." They talked until the sun came up, painting the Tucson sky in shades of pink and gold that looked nothing like the Afghan sunrise but beautiful nonetheless. Then they went to work, to briefings and flight planning and the routine of training missions that kept skills sharp between deployments. The ceremony, when it came, was exactly as uncomfortable as Kavik had feared. The entire wing attended, dress blues crisp in the Arizona heat, standing in formation while the wing commander read the citation. "For extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight as an A-10 pilot in support of Operation Freedom Sentinel. Captain Kavik distinguished herself by heroism while flying in support of ground forces under heavy enemy fire." Despite sustaining significant aircraft damage, Captain Kavik elected to remain on station and continue providing close air support, directly saving 12 lives and enabling the successful medical evacuation of critically wounded personnel. Her actions reflect great credit upon herself and the United States Air Force. The medal itself was a small thing, bronze and enamel, hanging from a ribbon that matched the service flag. The wing commander pinned it to her chest while photographers captured the moment for official records and public affairs. Then came the reception, the handshakes, the awkward conversations with senior officers who wanted to use her story as a teaching moment for their own purposes. Kavik endured it with the same discipline she used in the cockpit, smiling at the right moments, saying the expected things, counting down the minutes until she could escape. But there was one conversation she didn't mind. Master Sergeant Chen, her crew chief from Bagram, had flown in for the ceremony. He found her during the reception, still in his dress blues, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Ma'am wanted to say congratulations." "Chen, you didn't have to come all this way." Nah, I did. That jet you flew home, they're doing a full inspection on it now. Engineering wants to study it, figure out how it stayed together with that damage profile. They're calling it a case study in aircraft resilience. He pulled out his phone, showed her pictures of her old aircraft in a hangar, surrounded by engineers with measuring tools and analysis equipment. They found the hole you couldn't see from the cockpit. Right engine turbine blade cracked 3/4 through. Should have failed catastrophically at high power. Didn't somehow. The engineers are stumped. Kovic studied the photo, seeing the invisible margins she'd flown within. Luck. Nah, ma'am, skills. Luck is random. What you did was managed a dying aircraft so well that it didn't know it was supposed to be dead. Chen smiled. That's pilot skill. That's why I work on these birds, because eventually they meet a pilot like you who makes them perform miracles. He left her with that thought, and Kovic found herself thinking about it through the rest of the reception, through the drive home, through the quiet evening in her apartment. Miracles. She'd never thought of it that way. She'd thought of it as desperation, as necessity, as the unwillingness to accept that mathematics and physics got to decide who lived and who died that day. But maybe Chen was right. Maybe skill at the absolute edge of catastrophe looked like miracles to people who watch from the outside. The 6 weeks before her new assignment passed quickly. Kovic used the time to study Marine Corps tactics, to review previous deployments worth of CAS missions supporting Marine units, to prepare herself for the unusual role she was about to step into. She also spent time with her family, trying to explain what she'd done in a way that didn't terrify her mother or make her father, a Vietnam-era Air Force pilot himself too proud and too worried in equal measure. You turned around, her father said during dinner at her parents' house. It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact that carried weight he didn't need to explain. I did. How bad was the damage? She told him.